All right, for those of you that saw the other video dealing with injector flow testing, those were Mr. Taylor's. This is the next step in the saga of his running that methanol. As you recall, the injector filters clogged. We replaced the filters and they all flowed pretty well after that. They did indeed clog again, and he replaced the filters again. It was running okay, but the last time it was running poorly, had misfire. He narrowed it down to one injector. Now I can't duplicate the conditions that was causing that, but I think I can get kind of close to at least explain what was going on there. I'm going to go ahead and flow these. I'm going to run them at 7,000 RPM, 6 milliseconds. That's putting this thing at about a 70% duty cycle. Unfortunately, with these small graduated cylinders, I can't flow them a full minute. I can't even flow them a half a minute. I'm kind of stuck at 10 seconds. So we'll go ahead and flow them and we'll take a look, see what happens. I'm going to have to maintain pressure here. Alright, that was running at 3 bar, whatever that turns out to be, 43.5, somewhere thereabouts. Now if we take a look at them, they're relatively even. I've got somewhere in the range of, looks like 95 to 96, 94 to 96 in that range there. So, I mean, not perfect, but again, pretty decent. Now, as I flowed them, they were this even. I could go ahead and flow them at wide open, or do the static flow, but I'm not going to worry about that this time around. I can do that later on. There's no sense in filming it. So we'll get rid of that. Now, through looking at his system, it was discovered that there was a filter in the fuel pressure regulator that was clogged. What had happened then was, instead of running his normal, I don't know what he was running, 40, 50 psi, this thing was over 90 psi. So again, the regulator wasn't regulating, and we're thinking that that was the cause of the misfire. Now, it kind of seems odd. What he ended up doing was he sprayed carb cleaner into the engine and the misfire went away. He narrowed it down to one particular injector, moved that injector, and the misfire followed that injector, at least at idle. Okay, so what I'm going to attempt to do is show you my theory, what's going on with this. Now, I think we're running about 3 bar, 43.5, whatever, 42.5. Now, hopefully, you recall from class that the pivot bump on the current is where that injector actually opens. The pivot bump on the voltage is where the injector actually turns off. So what I'm going to do is just measure the time that it takes from the point where the injector is commanded on to the end of that pivot bump, just to see what kind of time we have. Alright, now if we look at that, we've got 1.34 milliseconds from the time the command was to turn the injector on to where the pivot bump is at least fully open. Now, there's some flow occurring before this, but this is the point where it more than likely becomes, I guess you could refer to it as a linear flow based on pressure and time. Then what I'm going to do is increase the fuel pressure now. Okay. This time can be referred to as injector dead time or injector latency time. So by increasing my fuel pressure, I'm going to see how that affects this. And I can tell you up front, as I was telling Mr. Taylor, it is going to increase that injector latency time. There we go. I'm increasing, and I went from about 40 psi, well, 42.5 psi. There's about 80 psi there. And notice that pintle opening has moved clear up to that point. Now let's see if I can relax this. My lovely little tester here is complaining loudly, but let's see what happens. right, we can see right there I've got about 1.6, almost 1.7 milliseconds dead time, or again injector latency time, simply by increasing the fuel pressure. Now back off a little bit. My little tool here is not the best, and you can see as I increase it even more, he was up over 90 psi, and you can see at that point right there, it kind of drops off. I'm going to run this at an idle with about 1.5 milliseconds, which really isn't that untypical at an idle. 1,000 RPM. I'm running this for a full 60 seconds so we can at least see an accumulation of fuel in this glass. Now, I suppose I could have run it at a higher RPM, but I'm trying to get things as close as I can to the conditions where Mr. Taylor said we had definite misfires at idle. Alright, so here we're flowing full minutes at about 3 bar with a 42.5 psi-ish. Alright, it's just under 30 cc's. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rerun that test, and I'm going to crank the pressure up as far as this little machine will let me. Again, I'm probably not going to be able to duplicate exactly Mr. Taylor's conditions, but we'll give it a whirl and see if it has a significant change on our fuel delivery. Alright, well, maybe not half. Well, actually, it's probably only delivered about half of what we had before with the lower fuel pressure. So you wouldn't think that that would be the case. Normally you increase fuel pressure, you also increase the volume of fuel delivered, unless it affects that dead period or that latency time for that injector, which it clearly did. So again, my guess is that although this injector was the only one that had a misfire, I'm guessing if he would have changed the fuel pressure a little bit more, we probably would have had some random misfires going on there as it pushed that dead time even further. Now, I'm going to go ahead, maybe to make this a little bit more dramatic, I could set the higher RPM to get a little better volume, and then stay with the same 2 milliseconds or so. So maybe I'll attempt that. All right, try 30 seconds there. I'm sure we'll get more fuel flow there. All right, so we got there about 75 cc's. We'll run it again with higher pressure. See how that goes. If the poor little machine lives. Okay, again, while I can't get quite the pressure Mr. Taylor was doing, I think you get an idea there. That time round, same time, same RPM, same pulse width, higher fuel pressure. Instead of showing a higher volume, instead of being what we were about 74, 75 before, it looks like I'm floating right there at about 50 cc's. Okay, so again, there was a decrease because of the increase in dead time or the latency time. So again, my guess is that is why Mr. Taylor went lean when his fuel pressure went high. It's because the latency period or the dead time of that injector increased greatly. Let's see if he's going to let me dump this.